Okay, so I'm going to call our panelists for panel 3 to come up. This panel includes Irene Mulvey, the former president of the American Association of University Professionals, Jeremy Young from the Freedom to Learn Pan America, Rebecca Everly from the National Academy of Sciences, and Dina Hurwitz from the Human Rights Law Educator and former founding director of the International Human Rights Law Clinic at UVA. Okay. So I'm also just going to remind panelists to keep the mic close so we could all hear and keep that. Issues around work intensification, managerialism, surveillance, labor rights, divestment from education as part of a broader political project, which are often done through the framing of top-down forms of governance and control, with policies and practices to narrow and control curriculum and constrain controversy, are all part of this broader project that we've been talking about that includes attacks on science, education, labor, and trade unions. So this panel will address some of the new policies and practices that have been adopted by government, by places like NYU and other universities to apply different policy decisions, like the IHRA definitions, and that govern and control what happens at schools. And so I hope that we can talk about what's happening on the ground. What are these policies in place? How are they shaping academic freedom? And what are some of the possibilities for understanding those things so we could challenge them and protect ourselves from them? So I'm going to turn it over to Irene to start. Irene Mulvey, who is the former president of the American Association of University Professionals and has been very involved in these discussions and debates in a very challenging year particularly, but these have gone way beyond last year.
Is this on?
Yes.
Am I good? Okay, thanks. Well, first of all, I want to thank Carol Ann. I want to thank the Coalition for Academic Freedom in the Americas, Scholars at Risk, PEN America, and NYU for organizing today's symposium on an essential topic and for inviting me to participate. My term as president of the American Association of University Professors ended last June, but when I was still in that office, I was honored to meet many of today's organizers and participants when we had several sessions with the UN Special Rapporteur during her official visit to the U.S. in order to discuss higher education in the United States. And I'd like to thank the UN Special Rapporteur from a place of deep appreciation for how thoughtfully she listened to us, for her excellent questions, and for her excellent work. And I look forward to the release of the report in June. I've been involved at the national level. I've been involved at the national level in higher ed for about 17 years, and I have never been as worried as I am right now. Maybe it's the impending election too, but I have never been as worried as I am right now. Events like this are crucial, of course, but in addition, faculty need to be organized on every campus and organized within each state to, as I'm, harkening back to things we've already heard, organized within each state to fight, since many decisions in the U.S. are made by a state legislature or a governor affect public education throughout the entire state. And we need to be, or faculty need to be organized even beyond the state level. So an event like this is extremely helpful for organizing efforts by educating faculty on resources available and on current threats and helping faculty make connections and build the alliances that are crucial for our work, protecting academic freedom, protecting our profession, protecting higher education as an essential public good in a democracy, and in protecting our very democracy. Carol Ann spoke eloquently on this in her introduction. I do want to give a shout out to AAUP's Organize Every Campus initiative. I would direct you to the AAUP website, aaup.org, where you can sign up for a 2-day training workshop scheduled for November 16th, 17th. The organizers have asked us to be brief, under 8 minutes, so that today's symposium can be interactive and engaging, and so I'm going to try and do that. I don't know when I started, but okay. Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, so anyways, they've asked us to be brief, so I'm going to just hit some highlights and what I think is most important for participants to take away. The AAUP was established in 1915 and is largely responsible for the principles, policies, and procedures that have made higher ed in the U.S. globally preeminent, although that status strikes me as a little fragile right now. The AAUP was established 109 years ago because our founders recognized the importance of academic freedom and faculty governance in institutions of higher education and the fragility of the entire enterprise. I'd go even more to talk about the fragility of all democratic institutions right now. But advancing and protecting academic freedom is AAUP's core mission. Academic freedom is not a job perk for fancy tenured faculty. It's an essential core pillar of democracy. It's essential in a democracy. When I was listening to earlier presenters, I made a note. I typed in university autonomy, and I want to thank Camilla Croso of CAFA for bringing that up, and I'm glad there's a full session on that later today. I thank her as well for pointing out that we have good and solid starting points for our fight. What Camilla and Jesse talked about, what Farida talked about, and the AAUP's long history of work. So AAUP was founded in response to outside interference into higher ed. That's our origin story. But our response was not just fighting back against outside interference, but in building the structures and establishing processes and procedures, especially regarding academic freedom and shared governance, that would allow institutions and the profession to fight back. There is a vast resource of statements, documents, investigations, and reports that define academic freedom, indicate its essentiality as a pillar of democracy, and articulate faculty-driven processes to adjudicate alleged violations of academic freedom. There's a vast resource of statements and documents that define shared governance, how it's supposed to work in a healthy institution, and why it's important. But these resources need faculty using them to be organized on a campus to be most effective. So that's takeaway number one. Get a copy of the AAP's Red Book. I usually bring one as a prop, but I forgot it. But recognize that the Red Book only contains a tiny fraction of the statements, the reports, the investigations, and essentially the century-long history of case law that the AAUP is responsible for. Takeaway number two is the only way to effectively fight back against these attacks are by being organized as a faculty on your campus and part of broader alliances statewide and beyond. Higher education has always been under attack. There's nothing new about what's happening now, except the differences are, the armed law enforcement arresting our students for peaceful protests. That's new. But higher education's always been under attack. Academic freedom is extremely fragile and must be protected, defended, and strengthened constantly. And the way to do that is by being organized in faculty governance structures, in AAUP chapters, and in broader coalitions. So my time is short, so I'm going to just have quick examples. New College of Florida. There's so many examples. I could be here all day. New College of Florida. AAUP did an excellent investigation, which I won't add to, but we have Libby Harity here today. She's the former president of New College Student Council, and I would simply ask that we take a moment to applaud her activism, her accomplishments, and her bravery in standing up to everything that went on at New College. NYU faculty know better than I do about what's all that's happened here. In particular, earlier this month, NYU settled a lawsuit brought by 3 Jewish students, and as part of that settlement, agreed to use the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, but not its examples. NYU Professor Sprigman had an excellent piece on this in the academic press. But I would draw your attention to the AAUP statement from 2022, Legislative Threats to Academic Freedom, Redefinitions of Anti-Semitism and Racism. Back in 2022, AAUP pointed out the connection between anti-CRT efforts, anti-DEI measures, and measures that would silence criticism of the policies of the State of Israel. I'm going to read one paragraph from the introduction. The past few years have seen an increase in partisan political attempts to restrict the public education curriculum and to portray some forms of public education as a social harm. Two targets are particularly evident: teaching about the history, policies, and actions of the State of Israel, and teaching about the history and perpetuation of racism and other accounts of state-enabled violence in the U.S. In both cases, conservative politicians have justified restrictive legislation under the guise of protecting students from harm, including discriminatory treatment or exclusion. In the first case, legislation defines anti-Semitism to include political criticism of the State of Israel. In the second, legislation defines critical analysis of the history of slavery and its legacies in the U.S. society as being itself racially discriminatory against whites. In this way, politicians obfuscate or deny the serious challenges their actions pose to free speech and academic freedom. The evident purpose of such legislation is to protect Israel or the United States from critical examination of their history and policies. And I just want to point out, I'm really proud that the AAUP was out in front on this. Again, this statement was from 2022. I know my time, I'm going to stop. One more, Cornell. The AAUP chapter at Cornell has been working overtime, and again, there's a million examples. They're all over the academic press and academic Twitter. But the AAUP chapter at Cornell has been pushing back against administrative actions one would expect to be unthinkable at an Ivy League institution. The way the chapter works with the governance is a model. The way the AAUP chapter is working with the Faculty Senate is a model for all of us. They brought up a resolution earlier this month. They're going to vote on it later. I'm just going to read the resolution and then I'm going to pass it over to Jeremy. Here's the resolution, because that more or less says it all. Faculty Senate resolution to contemn Cornell Vice President Joel Molina for violating faculty academic freedom by targeting specific faculty members for their protected speech, threatening to engage in surveillance of faculty in their classrooms, and threatening to take punitive action against faculty for this speech in the classroom. And for more information there, I would just direct you to the Cornell Daily Sun. They're doing an excellent job on this. So, you know, for the too long didn't read crowd, if your policies to protect students require suppression of speech and silencing of protest, silencing of speech and suppression of peaceful protest, your approach is wrong. So I'll stop there because we got a huge panel, a long panel. I'm just going to pass it on to Jeremy. Thank you.
All right. Well, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks. It's an honor for PEN America to be a co-sponsor of this event and to work with our dear friends and partners at Scholars at Risk and at CAFA and at NYU. So, and as well as thank you to my wonderful co-panelists. PEN America is a over 100-year-old organization that stands at the intersection of literature and human rights. Our mission is to celebrate literature and defend the freedoms that make it possible, of which the foremost is the freedom of expression. And the Freedom to Learn program at PEN America, which I direct, is a 3-year-old program that combats educational censorship legislation in state governments aimed at institutions of higher education. We've been tracking this legislation actually since late 2021. About 4 years ago, which seems like a lifetime ago in American politics, there was a moment of racial reckoning in the United States, reckoning with our history of racism, of slavery, encompassed by the George Floyd protests, the popularity of the New York Times 1619 Project and other similar materials. And there was a backlash against this moment of reckoning that focused particularly on issues of equity. And the initial form of this backlash came in the use of the term critical race theory, an academic theory, to misapplied and intentionally misidentified toward a variety of supposedly outrageous stories related to diversity work in educational settings. And in September of 2021, the advocates of these efforts pressed successfully President Trump to issue an executive order called On Race and Sex Stereotyping, which for the first time listed a series of 9 so-called divisive concepts that were ideas that related loosely to critical race theory, but really did not describe in any academic sense the meaning or import of critical race theory, and as such were incredibly vague and general. And these ideas that were prohibited included things such as the United States being a fundamentally racist country, or that anyone should receive adverse treatment on the basis of their race, gender, or identity. These prohibitions did not simply limit promoting those ideas, but rather mentioning that they exist. So, for instance, under a certain reading of this notion, you could describe it being illegal to mention in an educational setting that affirmative action is an idea that exists and was policy in the United States. The initial executive order restricted only trainings in government agencies, and it never truly went into effect. It was stayed by a court and then repealed on the first day of the Biden administration. But beginning in 2021, we began to see this language of the divisive concepts exported to state legislatures, where it was overwhelmingly aimed not at trainings, but at educational institutions, at the classroom. Initially, specifically in the K-12 setting, but over time, and as we come into the last couple of years, increasingly the focus has been higher education. The first year of these bills in 2021, we have been tracking these bills comprehensively for the last 4 years and writing it. We have an annual report, America's Censored Classrooms, on this legislation. The most recent one came out just a couple of weeks ago. In 2021, 50 of these bills were introduced and 10 became law. In 2022, there was a dramatic increase in this type of censorship legislation, in part because of a pervasive sense among many conservatives that these attacks on critical race theory were electoral winners. They had been part of the successful election of Governor Glenn Youngkin in Virginia and a come-from-behind race, and there was a sense that they would lead to many more victories for conservative politicians who promoted them. So there was a 250% increase in this legislation in 2022. And in 2023, we saw a real shift in how this legislation was approached. It certainly didn't go away. The numbers became a little bit less, in part because it had become clear through the results of the midterm elections that this was not actually an electoral winner, and these restrictions on educational speech were not actually popular. They are perhaps not unpopular enough to harm political candidates at the ballot box, but they certainly weren't winning any votes for anyone. And these bills also began to be struck down in the courts. The Stop Woke Act, the most extreme of what we call the educational gag orders, this first wave of educational censorship bills, was stayed by a federal court on the grounds that it violated academic freedom, that it violated the First Amendment, and that it was so vague that it was unconstitutional because it was impossible for anyone to comply with its myriad prohibitions on the divisive concepts. And because of these trends, because of these restrictions, proponents of censorship and of restrictions on academic freedom began to pivot away from direct speech restrictions on faculty and toward restrictions on university autonomy. The idea by early 2023 was that in the United States, it was probably a bad idea to try to prevent a professor from teaching critical race theory in their classroom. But you could very easily prevent them from being hired at all, or prevent their class from being taught, or prevent it from being listed for general education credit, which effectively means the class would not run because it would not receive enough students to make. Or restricting diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, the most well-known of these restrictions that we have seen on university autonomy, because the staff in diversity, equity, and inclusion offices are not faculty and therefore do not have academic freedom protections, and so they can can be disciplined. Their offices can be shuttered without any restrictions in theory on the First Amendment. So these autonomy restrictions came fast and furious in 2023, and they accelerated in 2024. For the first time in 2024, we saw more autonomy restrictions than restrictions on educational speech in the classroom. We've seen restrictions, the most common type, as I said, bans on diversity, equity, and inclusion offices or initiatives. We've also seen a lot of bills that restrict curriculum and general education and majors and minors, generally faculty-driven governance, just restricted by the legislature. We've seen increasingly restrictions on faculty governance, limiting the power of faculty senates and placing other restrictions on faculty authority. We've seen restrictions on faculty tenure, restrictions on the role of accreditation bodies in ensuring quality assurance at universities because of their role in promoting DEI standards for universities to meet. And finally, a series of restrictions on university speech under the guise of so-called institutional neutrality. But in reality, the legislation that requires universities to be neutral only requires them to be neutral on a set of issues related to race, gender, and identity, which are described in great detail and with dizzying arrays of ideas. Utah, for instance, banned universities from opining on the concept of bias. And in Iowa, over 20 ideas were listed that universities could not comment on as an institution. And at the end of the list, the law says, or any other related formulation of these concepts, which, depending on how one interprets it, could mean that any idea is banned for a university to comment on. In 2024, and this is our latest report, just out 2 weeks ago, what we've seen is, as I said, first of all, an escalation of this trend toward restrictions on university autonomy. But also, we have seen this movement go underground in ways that we hadn't seen before, in part, I think, because of the failure of the presidential campaign of Ron DeSantis, the national politician most prominently associated with these restrictions, having passed two of the most significant restrictions in Florida in 2022 and 2023. We have seen a shift away from splashy press conferences introducing new restrictions and toward instead restrictions that are passed in stealthier ways, either using the guise of laudable ideas such as intellectual or viewpoint diversity. There's a law in Iowa that claims it's promoting intellectual diversity in the classroom, but if you actually look at the mechanism it uses, that mechanism is that the trustees, the board of trustees at any university can summarily fire any professor they deem in their judgment not to be promoting intellectual diversity or who might not promote intellectual diversity in the future. So it is effectively an end to faculty tenure. We've seen a lot of moves like that. We've also seen, the other thing we've seen is, particularly in the last 6 months, a dramatic increase in jawboning, where lawmakers are avoiding having a hearing where they can be protested by commenters or a law that is passed that can be challenged in the courts, and are instead going directly to university leaders and threatening them with funding cuts or other restrictions unless they voluntarily cut their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, restrict their curricula, or make other changes. So this is the trend that we're seeing. It is not getting better. It is getting significantly worse. But it's also getting quieter. There's less news coverage of it because it's not being driven by national politicians as a sort of political winner in the way that it was before. And I'll close by saying that we are very concerned. This conference is very important, and similar events are very important because what has happened by shifting from attacking the academic freedom of individual faculty to attacking the autonomy of university governance decisions is that the critics, the opponents of intellectual freedom on campus, have moved away from something where there is a robust intellectual tradition in the United States, the academic freedom of faculty, dating all the way back to, I would say, the first AAUP statement of 1915 on academic freedom, and certainly codified in the 1940 statement. There is a general understanding among the public of what academic freedom is and that it is important to be preserved. There's very little understanding in this country of the value of protecting university level administrators from the ideological control of the government. We hear people like Christopher Rufo, one of the architects of this campaign, argue that taxpayers pay for a university, and so they should get to determine what is done and taught and said in that university. And there is a lot of agreement with that idea in the United States, and we need to be able to promote an awareness that while taxpayers have and governments have a great influence in many aspects of the university, in ensuring that students are successful, that they matriculate on time, that they have equitable access, the tuition remains low and affordable, that student safety is protected, that budgets are being spent properly. These are all reasonable positions for the government to have some influence. The government must stay resolutely outside of universities on ideological questions. The government has no place in dictating what ideas can or cannot be on a college campus. One of the ways that we try to explain this at Penn is when taxpayers pay for a university, they pay for it to be a university, which means that it must be a place where all ideas can receive a fair hearing. When taxpayers fund a playground or a ball field, that playground or ball field is available for anyone who wants to use it, not just people who agree with the government that made it. And that same principle holds for universities. So there's a very important need to socialize this concept within the public for Americans to understand that attacks on academic freedom are the kind of subversion of democracy similar to the attempted theft of an election or depriving voters of their right to vote. This is a central attack on democracy. We need to understand that, and events like this will help us convey that. So I thank you all for being here, and I'll yield to the next speaker.
So I'd also, of course, like to join my fellow panelists in thanking the organizers of this event. It is really such a pleasure and an honor to be with all of you, as well as the organizers, the panelists, of course, the special rapporteur. To your point about what happens to reports once they've been let out into the world, I will tell you, at the risk of sounding like a stalker, that I pore over the report. When I have a question about academic freedom, I go to your report, I go to Penn, I go to AAUP, and of course, SAR. So real honor for me to be on this panel. Thank you. What I'd actually like to do with my time, apart from just telling you a little bit about my organization, what it is, what it does, is rather than educating you, to really explain to you or tell you about something that I'm struggling with, that my organization is struggling with, related to the slice of academic freedom that we work on. Because I hope that this is something that's been alluded to earlier today, but I hope it's something that can come up again and again, because I would be very interested in getting the thoughts of fellow panelists and those of you in the room. So to provide a little bit of background, I direct something called the Committee on Human Rights within the National Academy of Sciences, as well as the National Academy of Engineering and Medicine in the United States. And this is a body of scientists and scholars, US and some scholars from other parts of the world as well, who are elected by their peers for membership in this organization. And the National Academies also host something called the National Research Council, and this council does research, as you might expect, and provides recommendations on pressing challenges related to science and tech and health, like ranging from climate change to public health emergencies. So that's the National Academies. At the same time, my Committee on Human Rights is the secretariat for an international consortium of national science and medical academies with a shared interest in human rights. And for decades, in the case of the US Committee on Human Rights, almost half a century, we have been really concerned with issues related to academic freedom. But when I say that we talk about a slice of academic freedom issues, I'll share with you the focus of our work. So that has been situations where there have been really direct attacks by government authorities on colleagues, professional colleagues, scientists and scholars, situations where maybe they are subjected to grossly unfair trials or put in arbitrary detention or forcibly disappeared or subjected to torture or other forms of ill treatment. And I think in talking with a lot of people over the course of the time that I've worked for the committee, I think folks have sometimes been confused about that. Why would you, why would you have a situation where, you know, a biologist or an economist is put into jail? But, you know, for those of you in the room, this may be a bit of a no-brainer, but, you know, the idea that, for instance, you have a science or a researcher who writes an article critical, that's seen to be critical of the government, and then they end up being punished for that, or someone who's doing research on very sensitive issues within their societies, for instance, related to gender, and that's seen as somehow countering government narratives on that particular topic, and so they get thrown into jail, or you know, they're attacked for some reason. So these are the kind of concerns that we've worked on internationally and in the United States. So I just tell you one. We have worked on these very serious issues in the United States. So recently, just to take an example, we joined with other scientists and scholars in the United States in advocating for justice in the cases of several colleagues of Asian descent who were accused of national security offenses as a result of their collaborations with colleagues in China. And the context for our advocacy in these cases, again, in conjunction with collaboration with many, many scholars throughout the United States, has been that there have been, in the past few years, many of you may know, several investigations and prosecutions of scientists of Asian descent, that, you know, cases brought, allegations of disloyalty in some cases, and then the cases ended up falling apart once the facts came to light. So just to say that in the United States as well, we're working on these we have worked on very serious issues, and we will continue. And we think that these cases of direct governmental attacks on scientists and scholars are really important. But the thing that I wanted to raise here is something that we're really struggling with, grappling with, and that is the issue of attacks from members of the public, so threats and harassment. And obviously, this is not new. For many, many years, there have been attacks on climate scientists, for instance. There's this very famous case of climatologist Michael Mann, attacks on and harassment and violence directed against researchers working on gun violence. But in my office, so again, an office that really, to the extent that we're working on academic freedom, we're really looking at these direct attacks by government. Particularly beginning with the pandemic, we started to hear a lot of, hear about a lot of cases where colleagues had been threatened, harassed, their families threatened and harassed. I'm talking about, you know, we're going to kill you, we're going to kill your children, doxxed, because of their work. And in a lot of cases, those concerns were coming from researchers working on infectious diseases and public health more generally. And we've also heard those sorts of concerns coming from researchers who work on issues related to racism and xenophobia, including in medicine. There have been some very high profile cases. So this is concerning. And it's often directed, these cases often seem to be directed toward researchers who have they engage with the public in some way. It seems to be, as you would imagine, exacerbated by issues related to, by use of social media, digital means of communication. So there hasn't been a lot of research on this, actually. We've seen it internationally as well, but definitely in the United States. And there has been some research, some very good research on attacks against public health officials, for instance, during the pandemic. And so we have convened a forum to address attacks on health professionals globally, and a lot of those are clinicians. There's been some research on attacks against clinicians, although there needs to be more. But in terms of the data on attacks against scientists and scholars as a result of their work, there needs to be a lot more work done. There have been pieces, for instance, in Science and Nature about this problem. There was, I think, maybe 21 or 2022, I think 2021, Nature put out an article described a survey that they had done of several hundred researchers, public health researchers who'd engaged with the public about the pandemic. And I think it had some really worrying results. It was nearly a quarter of those research had received threats of physical or sexual violence. 15% of those research had received death threats. So very concerning, obviously. And you know, anecdotally, we hear about this more and more, and there seems to be, from what we're hearing, a link between, again, as you would imagine, these sorts of threats and the chilling effect, the fear of, if this is what I get when I go out into the media and talk about my work, I'm not going to go out in the media and talk about my work anymore. The other very worrying thing that we've heard from some senior scientists is that their younger colleagues have started to say, I don't want to go into X field, or I don't want to go into a particular scientific discipline or field where I'm engaging with the public because I don't want to have that kind of backlash and I don't want to endanger my family. So I'm just going to close by saying that I raise this for two reasons. One is the reason that I alluded to earlier, and that is for an organization like mine, a small organization, and also this international consortium, that has worked on academic freedom issues from a human rights, maybe it's a sort of traditional human rights standpoint, you know, not denying that human rights abuses can come from different groups within society, but really focused on those direct governmental attacks, often through the criminal justice system. Something like this presents a real challenge, and why it's really useful for me to be in a community of people who are thinking about these issues, and how to actually help in a situation like this. The second is, I think what we're seeing with researchers and public harassment and violence directed at researchers does seem to be of a piece with what we've seen. And I think it was Jesse who might have alluded to this problem of attacks against you know, human rights defenders and journalists and members of civil society and election workers. And, you know, you've probably seen there was a piece in the Times the other day about death threats directed at meteorologists who had reported on Hurricane Helene because people didn't like what they were saying. So again, of a piece seems to be consistent with these concerns that so many of us have about polarization within the United States, about mis and disinformation. And so anyway, I sort of, you know, I'll tell you just very quickly what we've been doing, but it's just a start. We've been trying to, within my organizations and the groups that I work with internationally, we've been trying just baby steps to raise awareness about these issues through in-person events, through virtual events. We have scoured, you know, your websites to look at all the guidance that you put out, and have tried to put together resources, curate research, put them together for members of our national academies and academies around the world, from Penn and AAUP and SAR, and of course the special rapporteur. And then, you know, we're aware that there are universities that are starting to think about this issue and have tried to put in some mechanisms in place to protect their faculty. But of course, what we've heard from many scholars is, oh, we need much more support from our universities. So this is a challenge we have, and if we could discuss this as part of our more general discussions today, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much.
Well, also, let me extend my deep appreciation to Carol Ann Spreen for inviting me, and to the other sponsors of this conference. It's really important. I also want to explain myself here, because I did teach. I'm actually identified as the former director, founder and director of the International Human Rights Law Clinic at the University of Virginia School of Law, but I don't teach anymore. The reason for that is actually political and disappointing, but I won't go into that here. I do want to say that I hold leadership positions in the American Bar Association, including being a member of the President's Task Force on Islamophobia and a board member of the Center for Human Rights. And a big part of why I want to focus on what I'm going to talk about, which is the IRA definition that Irene Mulvey brought up, is because I was centrally involved in an extremely contentious debate within the ABA 2 years ago about including the IRA definition in a policy resolution on anti-Semitism, and we succeeded in keeping it out, which was a very big deal. Of course, I need to say that I speak entirely in my personal capacity. I in no way represent the American Bar Association. So I want to discuss what I consider to be two really central problems. Am I speaking? Am I eating this? Okay, good. With the way that educational institutions are dealing with the protests of the Gaza war. One is, how did anti-Zionism become synonymous with anti-Semitism? And how is it that Zionism is an example of a protected identity? And why are these fallacies so pernicious? So I want to take NYU's non-discrimination and anti-harassment policy, which I'll call the NDAH for short, I think everybody does, as an example, and focus on the International Holocaust Remembrance Act or Alliance definition of anti-Semitism that NYU incorporates, and I see as a poison root strangling academic freedom. There's also, those of you who are students here will know, faculty too, I assume, that there's an oath, I believe, that students have to sign, pledging to abide by the definition of anti-discrimination and anti-harassment, non-discrimination, anti-harassment, in order to access their personal accounts here, I think, and in other words, function as a student in an institution to which they pay tuition. And the NDAH recognizes that a protected identity includes both actual and perceived identity, no problem there, and that shared ancestry and ethnicity is a legal concept that means the country, world, religion, or place where a person or their ancestors come from. But it also includes a really overbroad statement of characteristics, that many characteristics, expressions, and cultural practices are closely associated with a protected identity. And if those are targeted, they may run afoul of the policy. Their two examples are Dalits and Zionists. Well, first of all, I hope I don't have to, they are not comparable. They're not at all comparable. Dalits or untouchables were born into a social strata of extreme marginalization. The NDAH itself states that classification by caste are imposed on members of religious and ethnic groups, including some South Asians, and conduct against Dalits may also run afoul of the policy. So to explain the other example, the language is, many Jewish people consider Zionism as a part of their Jewish identity. So conduct that would violate our policies if targeting Jewish or Israeli identities can also violate our policies if directed to Zionists. First of all, Zionism is not a social class or strata. It's not a component of religion, ethnicity, or any other protected class. It is a political ideology. It was founded, Zionism was founded in 1897 by Theodor Herzl as a political movement to find a homeland for the Jews, a place where Jews could live securely. It's a movement or ideology of Jewish nationalism. It's not Israeli nationalism. Israel was established in 1948 as the outcome of the Zionist movement, and incidentally, one of the other locations that were considered was British East Africa, which is now Kenya. Zionism is not a Jewish identity. Many Jews, many Israelis consider themselves non-Zionists or anti-Zionists, which means that they are critical of religious nationalism. There was a 2022 poll of American Jews, and when Zionism was defined as, quote, the belief in privileging Jewish rights over non-Jewish rights in Israel, unquote, 69% of American Jews said they were probably or definitely not Zionist. And it's worth mentioning that according to a recent estimate, American Christian Zionists outnumber Jewish Zionists by 5 to 1. So for many Jews, Zionism And what it means for Palestinians is irreconcilable with what Judaism says about treating the stranger or repairing the world, which is the concept of tikkun olam. And if that's not a part of Jewish identity, I don't know what is. So let's consider how anti-Semitism is defined. There is no international law standard that defines anti-Semitism. But it's worth mentioning that international law clearly prohibits discrimination on both racial and religious grounds, and it obligates states to address and eliminate such discrimination. So there are three non-binding definitions of anti-Semitism. The one that we started talking about is the IHRA, or International Holocaust Remembrance Act, IHRA, IHRA definition, which I won't read you, but it's basically very short, seemingly straightforward. What's really important, and Irene mentioned this, is that this definition is accompanied by 11 contemporary examples of anti-Semitism, 7 of which are about Israel. And these examples, whether they're codified or not, are used to determine whether speech is anti-Semitic, consistent with the IHRA's definition, and they result in the conflation of criticism of Israel with bias against Israel or outright anti-Semitism. This has resulted in the IHRA definition's regular use to restrict free speech, rights to assembly, association, protest, other rights. So for example, a couple of the contemporary examples. One is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Another is applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. A third is drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. So to me, and I hope to many of you, that those are examples of basically political speech. I mean, without a doubt, they veer off into threatening speech and dangerous anti-Semitism, but they are not per se. So now, while advocates of the IHRA definition present it as a consensus and non-controversial definition, it's the lead author of the definition, Kenneth Stern, has repeatedly argued against incorporation of the IHRA definition into domestic legislation or policy. He's emphasized that it was never intended to be used as a measure of hate or to target criticism of Israel and pro-Palestinian speech. And the IHRA definition has been challenged vigorously by hundreds of anti-Semitism experts, rabbis, scholars of Jewish studies, Jewish history, the Holocaust, by Palestinians who have borne the brunt of its application, as well as by experts on fighting racism and free speech. These experts have published hundreds of reports and articles articulating their concerns and objections. They've presented testimony before Congress and even before the American Bar Association in connection with that resolution. Concern about the misuse, either the misuse of and or the plain text of the IHRA definition among Jewish scholars is so acute that it has given rise so far to 2 other mainstream independent projects aimed at developing alternative definitions. One is the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, which was devised by a group of scholars in the fields of Holocaust history, Jewish studies, and Middle Eastern studies, including Israelis. And the Nexus document, which was put together by a task force on Israel and anti-Semitism, which is affiliated with the programs on hate studies at Bard College and the University of Southern California. And they've tried to define when Israel criticism crosses the line. Just a bit of background on IHRA. This working definition originated in 2004 in the American Jewish Committee as a tool to guide European governments in collecting data on and for anti-Semitism. And around 2010, and this is in the words of Kenneth Stern, who was involved in the beginning as a lead author in it, around 2010, groups on the pro-Israel right started marrying Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 with the definition, bringing cases alleging a civil rights violation predicated in part on things like what Israel-related texts the professor assigned, what speakers were coming to campus, what films were being shown. At the same time, a cottage industry, what's been called a cottage industry of right-wing organizations with support from Israeli representatives, have been quietly working to codify the IRA definition. And in 2016, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, of which the United States is a member, adopted a non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism with its examples. And that's when IRA started becoming a political tool for identifying and silencing criticism of Israel. In 2019, former President Trump implemented Executive Order 13899 that stated that the executive branch shall consider the 2016 IRA definition, including the examples, when looking into civil rights complaints, including those that are filed to the Department of Education with respect to allegations of discrimination on campus. Even before that executive order, proponents of the IRA working definition have been promoting it as non-legally binding, but this is contradicted by the extensive efforts to codify it into law. There was the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which was in a previous session of Congress. I think it was passed in the House, but it didn't come out of the Senate. The Combating Anti-Semitism Act, also I think passed in the House. Very heavy push to get it passed this session, not successful. It instructs federal, state, and local agencies to use the IRA definition. Importantly, and I really want to emphasize this, it is also encouraging anti-Semitism curricula in K through 12 education, and that means incorporating the IRA definition with its examples into the schools. While efforts to adopt federal legislation incorporating the definition have not been successful, numerous US states and municipalities have incorporated the definition into legislative measures. Of course, supporters have framed these measures as fighting anti-Semitism, but statements by lawmakers and pro-Israel advocates have underscored the intent of these laws to target advocacy for Palestinian rights and criticism of Israel and Zionism. An example, Randy Fine, who's the Florida state representative behind Florida's law adopting IRA, explained, and this came in an email that was obtained through a FOIA request, explained his hopes for what the bills would achieve in these terms. Students for Justice in Palestine is now treated the same way as the Ku Klux Klan, as they should be. Some of these laws in the states specifically target human rights advocacy. For example, in 2019, Florida adopted legislation to codify IRA into law and included, quote unquote, focusing peace or human rights investigations only on Israel as an example of anti-Semitism. In Arizona, a state law requires courts to consider criticism of Israel that falls within the IRA definition as an aggravating factor for hate crime sentencing in criminal convictions, meaning that criticism of Israel could result in harsher sentences for protesters charged with a crime. Codification, I'll skip, I know I'm running out of time here. But I wanted to mention that in one of her annual reports, the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism noted that although the IRA working definition is promoted as being non-legally binding, its de facto influence on the policy and practice of governments and private actors has contributed to violations of the human rights of freedom of expression, assembly, and political participation, among others. It's precisely the soft law status of the working definition that effectively helps to undermine, you're putting up the card that says your time is up. I'm going to go real quickly and finish this up, to undermine certain coexistent rights. So why did NYU and other schools incorporate it? Heavy lobbying, multiple complaints filed with the Department of Education. NYU has stated in its NDHA, AH, that it's fulfilling its legal obligations. What are these legal obligations, and what are political and policy decisions by nervous administrators? The Department of Education Office of Civil Rights has issued guidelines which are cited by NYU as part of their obligation, their legal obligations, on the guidelines on protected identities and what institutions are required to protect against discrimination, harassment. They consistently emphasize that actions must be consistent with and informed by First Amendment principles, that their guidelines, including the IRA definition that might be referenced in them, which it isn't to great extent, do not have the force of law and are not binding, and that after years of demands by pro-Israel groups and right-wing politicians to enshrine IRA in federal regulations, the Department of Education avoided reference to the IRA definition and focused its resources on addressing threats of bigotry by white supremacists. After the Gaza war, the most recent guidelines say speech expressing views regarding a particular country's policies or practices is protected by the First Amendment and does not necessarily implicate federal civil rights laws. So I'll just finish up. I have a few more things that I would say, but just to mention that NYU settled, I think, Irene, you mentioned this, settled the lawsuit. This was actually in 2020, so this is a previous lawsuit. I think it was called Ingber, stating that at NYU will not use the examples of anti-Semitism cited, but to implement policies. But the newer NDHA, and you said this wasn't happening, but I'll have to go back and check it, Irene. They changed the terms of the Ingber settlement. And they now are saying that they will review and implement all applicable regulations and guidance from the DOE using the IRA definition and the accompanying examples. So thank you for putting up with me.
Thanks to all of our panelists for a very rich and nuanced and deep understanding of these issues. I think this is absolutely critical for all of us to be aware of the legal guidelines, parameters, the examples on the ground, the advocacy strategies that we are employing. It's absolutely essential to be informed about this because, I mean, part of the reason we put this together was because over and over, I kept hearing like, oh, that's really terrible about this instance. And then, oh, this is a terrible thing over here. But nobody was connecting the dots and thinking about how we need to come together and share and understand the history that takes us through this and why academic freedom is so central.